So the first question to kick things off is a question, I suppose, to all of you. I mean, high output systems can look very different. What's the one non-negotiable element of your systems that you believe others should adopt? What's the most important thing?
For us, I mean, measurement is everything, I guess. Measure, whether that be silage stocks, heifer inventories, hours worked, quality of work, everything. We try to measure as many things as we can, and we'll automate as much of that measurement as possible, making sure we never get to a point where we run out of something or we can't do anything, or the quality of whatever drops. That's massive. Every day has to be the same.
Connor, the most important for you?
Not much left to say after what Keith said. I'd say consistency. Try and keep, consistent routines, consistent forage. Try and keep everything. If you find that something's working, try and keep it, consistent and simple. Don't try and overcomplicate it. Like
Measurement and consistency, Niall.
Yeah, I think very similar. I obviously going from kind of what we're used to the US, I got very intimidated by the large herds initially. But then I realized if you do the basic things, you're already above average. If you give them enough time to rest, you got food in front of them, and they're not standing around too long milking or waiting to be served or anything like that. So just making sure the rest, the eating, and the standing around time is cut down, you can make a lot of progress.
So that's really an eye to detail in terms of management?
Yeah.
Making sure the cow has exactly what she wants at the right time. Okay, looking at the questions on Slido, there's definitely the top question here is a genomic question. And I suppose I'll direct it to Connor first. Sometimes a high genomic animal doesn't look like the best animal whatsoever. How would you convince everyone here to trust the genomic test?
I hadn't seen a milk buyer yet that pays you for how they look. It's how they produce. It's the way they go and calve. Like we've had a number of 100-ton cows, and they weren't the flashiest. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
It's not all about beauty. It's in the.
It's how they, like as I say, it's how they produce.
And would you say that you've experienced that?
Oh, aye, yep.
And then to Keith, what's your experience of that?
I think it's invariably you get what you breed for, and form follows function, right? If we want cows to live a long time, we need to pick for lifespan. They'll look the way they look to get there. If we want cows to get in calf, we can breed for fertility, right? And they're going to look how they look to get there. But invariably for us, we run like 30% VG 2-year-olds. We consistently have 94, 95 point cows, and we're also top of the genomic rankings, not quite the top, but pretty high up there. I don't think the two are mutually incompatible. It's not just, Niall's point about heritability was really important. Right, heritability is just a measure of environment, and that goes into all of those conformation traits just the same way it does fertility or milk or anything else. And we need to sort of get our heads around the fact that those cows are going to look how we need them to look to do the job that we need them to do. That doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to be dogs, but they're going to look. And the average cow today, this is a really important point. The average cow today is a really good-looking cow, right? If you have a linear that's bang on zero all the way down, she'll look like a really, really good cow. It's when we get extremes that it gets more difficult. And so, yeah, I think it's sort of like Connor said, she'll look how she'll look, and she'll perform how she'll perform, but everyone loves a 100-ton cow.
You'd stated a point about bulls beating genetic tests. Could you expand on how you evaluate a bull's potential beyond the genomic index?
Bulls are gonna breed how they're gonna breed. Like that proof is how he's gonna breed, right? But some bulls will perform much better for individual farms than others. And a lot of that is to do with how that P equals GE, how that environment interacts with those genetics, and how those cows will come together. So, and it's back to this heritability point that in hindsight, I should have raised before on my talk, but Niall did it for me. So, like, heritability is just a measure of environment. If we go to our individual farms, one calf born one day and another calf born the next basically have exactly the same environment their entire life, right? Whereas a calf born at my farm and a calf born at Connor's farm on the same day probably have pretty different environments and pretty different lives, right? And we're expecting these genetics to express themselves the same across both our farms, and that's why the heritability is low. Heritability goes much higher, as Niall said, on a farm-by-farm basis. And so reviewing how those phenotypes come out, reviewing how they correlate with your genetics on farm can make a big difference. I mean, when I worked at Genus, I used to work with a block calver in the autumn who didn't get any response to milk, ever. But he got unbelievable responses to fat and protein. And so we just stopped breeding for milk, right? And we just bred for fat and protein components because that was what the cows were expressing on his dairy, and we can all do that.
Niall, Keith has mentioned you twice in terms of heritability. And I suppose to pick up a point, you'd mentioned that conception rate has a heritability of, is it 0.01? Heifer conception rate. So how do you justify selecting for it in breeding programs, and how can the data help?
Well, I suppose the point was raised, as Keith's saying, it's effect on the environment, and it's measured on a population, across the whole population of Holsteins, wherever you're, if it was in the US or over here. And even though it's very low, if your bottleneck in management lets it express higher, you'll get bigger results with it. So if your management isn't holding that back, if your nutrition's good, if things are lining up, even though it's a very low heritable trait, you can really make good gains with it.
Okay, because the figure seems low, but still you can make good gains.
Yeah, you could see that difference. We had a 25% difference between in conception rate, heifer conception rate, between their bottom 20% and their top 20%. So that's a massive difference. Even though on paper it looks 0.01, but in reality, 25% difference heifer conception rate's strong.
And a question directly to you, Keith. There's good interest on the 4 criteria. I suppose it's the formula you put up on the screen for your genetic change. Could you, do you mind going through it again, just listing those 4 criteria?
No, so selection intensity. So how many animals we need to contribute to the next generation. So for example, like a really good trait to do that is sex serum, right? If we're going to generate 100 heifers from conventional serum, we need to make 200 pregnancies. On sex serum, we only need to make about 110, right? So that really improves your selection intensity. Accuracy of selection, right? So if we're going to go from 200 pregnancies to 100 pregnancies, but we choose the wrong ones, we can actually go backwards. And so a good thing there would be like genomics, right? So instead of picking on a 35% reliability, we're picking at like 65. Heritability or variance, so what's the range in the genetics that goes in, right? Makes a massive difference to how fast your progress is. And generation interval, so how quickly we turn it over, right? And the quicker we can turn it over, the faster the change we can make. So breed those heifers young, get them calving in again, get them contributing to the next generation as soon as possible.
And on, I think it was the same slide you mentioned, P equals G times E. Phenotype is genotype times environment. How much can we, environment's a big part to play with this. How can we influence environment, and what are some of the points for the best environment to get the best genetics potential out of your cows?
Well, there's 2 different ways to look at that, right? So we talked about bottlenecks earlier, right? And sometimes you can have the best environment ever, but you've got one thing that holds you back from that, that expression of production. But the other way is, everything we can do to improve cow performance, to make that cow more comfortable, to make that cow improve her feed, to give her a more consistent life, will allow her to express her genetics better. We talked about managing high-yielding systems, or getting genetics to express on high-yielding is the same. It's just consistency, right? The 100-ton cows, are they destined to be 100-ton cows from birth? 100% not, right? Otherwise, basically every cow would be a 100-ton cow, right? All that's happened is she's got lucky a lot, right? When you used that really horrible calving ease bull, she had a different pregnancy, right? When you had a really bad bout of toxic mastitis, she didn't get it because she sat in the dry bed versus the wet bed. Like, what we've got to do is reduce the variability that environment is and keep it consistent and consistently good.
Is this potentially back to what Niall says about eye to detail?
Yeah.
And getting things right, just. One question, top question there. Is PLI still a suitable index for Northern Irish farms? Conor, do you have?
That's a loaded question.
That's a hang.
It definitely has a place in Northern Ireland, yes. Going forward, it's probably, I was looking at the finer details within the index. As an index, it's a good start. Now, when I did solely go on PLI, but I felt it was losing a wee bit of production. But that's just me personally, because I'm a total confined herd. Like, we're on the side of a hill, so we really are more production focused now. But for the general population, yep, I would say so.
Niall, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really good index. It really depends on your system. I think, Conor's definitely, I've seen, the correlation between 8-wheat milk, say, and PLI. And if you're going to, the ideal then, if you're going to use PLI, is pick the ones with high milk as well, if that's your system. Because it does bring, you could go custom index, but you need something to measure your progress, and you could just pick within PLI what you're focusing on as well.
I've got carried away in the questions here, which are coming in through Slido. Have we any questions on the floor? Questions down the back. Richard?
Richard Holleran, I'm a farming journalist. Does A plus B minus C as a pricing system suit a high input, high output dairy farming operation?
Well, I have moved on to Arrivo's A plus B because our solids are over the threshold. So you breed for your milk, you breed for your fat, and you breed for your protein. But definitely, yep. Like as I say, we have moved on. We had the option of going, either staying on our traditional payment or moving on to the A plus B. But on the figures that Arrivo done, last year I'd have been about £10,000 better off. So, yep. You need to keep solids in there, keep your percentage and keep your kilos.
We're a manufacturing-based contract at home, and we're consistently. I spent a week at 5% fat last year. Just because you're high input or high output doesn't mean that you're going to be shipping milk at 3.5 and 3.2. I think it all depends on what the minus C is a bit, but that's up for you to manage. I think we're in a situation and an environment now where high input, high output doesn't just mean shipping 12,000 litres of milk. It means kilos of fat and protein per day, and being up on 3.1, 3.2, not 2.6, 2.7.
Any more questions from the floor? Okay. Niall, this is a question to you. You described the cow as a metabolic athlete. How do we balance that peak performance of the metabolic athlete with longevity and with health and with keeping that metabolic athlete in the herd?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's that first couple of weeks, like Bradley Biggins cycling up the hill, you have to prepare them properly is one. And I think the nutrition, like we base a lot of the nutrition world on, the cow's needs, but that first 2 weeks, she's quite a different animal, as from a physiological point of view. And it's hard to manage her as an individual when she's in a large group. But I think, you got what Conor showed, the robotic feeding, and there's technology coming along, which we had the advantage, I suppose, in the US of scale, being able to group fresh cows together. But I mean, we definitely still had the challenges, but being able to manage that cow for that first couple of weeks, I think, is a big key to it. And the breeding, the genetics, because, how we kind of measure like there's different, for example, productive life was a big measurement in the US, but when high beef prices come, that is a very difficult measurement because cows are being beef right, left, and center. Livability, they move to livability, so that's the survivability on farm, and I think it's a better measure for longevity.
Connor and Keith, how do you manage your metabolic athletes? Do you find it tough, or how do you balance it with keeping the cow in the herd?
First thing's in good technology, so that's your rumination, your things that rumination collars, whatever that may be, just ways of monitoring them, that if there's something wrong, you get on top of it quick. But the main thing's a good dry cow diet, like good dry cow management. You know, get them transitioned right and get them into production and get them going like.
So it's preparing that dry cow.
Your dry cow's like the pre-season training that Man United didn't go on.
Keith, you're nodding.
Yeah, can't do anything but echo that, right? You know, if cows start well, they'll finish well. You know, I think it is important to get the balance between replacement rate and death rate, right? You know, as Niall was saying, there are times when running a pretty high replacement rate can be a pretty valuable thing to do. What none of us want to do is run high mortality, right? So, and when do we have those high mortality events? It's early lactation when cows are under peak stress. So, getting that transition diet right, the first couple of weeks of that lactation right is really important.
Question here for Connor. After your Gaia feeding robot, how do you evaluate the return on investment beyond yield? You know, do you measure labour, do you cow health, management?
Well, it's a combination of all. So like you have gains in performance, you have gains in new animal health. I think part of the reason our components have really driven on the last year is just the rumen health that being fed six, seven times a day. You know, it's taking that greedy cow out of the equation, but it's an equation of, you know, what it costs versus what you're improved, and then your energy saving and time, like the time savings roughly around 2 hours a day, labour. And it's easier, you know, our main man's been with us now 7-8 years. If you had a nice environment for somebody to work in, they're more likely to stay with you. You know, when they're not being killed and driven as slaves, like.
Yeah. And there's some really practical questions on the robot itself. One of them was how many hours of labour, which you've said 2-3 hours. What about?
No, there's 2 to 3 hours saving, so that takes around half an hour a day. You know, topping up the feeders, topping up the mineral hoppers, and washing the sensors, that type of thing.
And can the system cope with round bale silage? A really practical question.
In a word, no. Now, the brother did warn me, they're probably not equipped to try round bales, but you know the way you try stuff anyway. I did put one in one night, but I was never glad to see a thing out of it. Probably wetter than this was dry haylagey stuff. I would say wetish bales you probably could if they were well enough chopped, but I think it's not worth trying.
Any questions from the floor? Put your hand up. We have 2 people at the back, again, with mics. I'll continue on with Niall. Another question on metabolism. We hear a lot about fat metabolism, but recently there's been a chat about protein metabolism. Have you heard much about that? Can you explain maybe the difference and which one is important, and how important is protein metabolism, or is it all about energy and fat?
It's really, they're both obviously important. The fat's got a lot of the attention because it creates the big bottleneck with fatty liver because it's mobilized really fast. But you know, the cow strips a lot of, she breaks down the muscle and it goes in to create the glucose as well through different cycles. So they both happen. I mean, you can see that Bradley, I get the right one, Bradley Wiggins, you know, his top half was kind of, you know, he'd lost a lot of muscle even though his legs are quite muscular, but you do lose, the dairy cows do lose quite a bit of muscle. There's been quite a few recent papers done, but yeah, fat gets most of the attention, but I do think that the cow in the first couple of weeks, we've worked with higher protein diets and seen a lot of benefit just for those first 2 weeks or so, because cows don't eat in percentage, they eat in grams, and they're losing a lot of protein, so I found that an advantage to up the protein in the first couple of weeks.
Generalized protein, or do you go as specific as balancing amino acids or anything like that?
Yeah, just generalized protein, but yeah, getting in, making sure there's RUP in there as well.
Keith and Connor, is it something you would consider as well, or is it you leave it to?
That's what our nutritionists are paid for.
Another question, I suppose, Niall. Has dry matter intake potential in high-yielding dairy cows kept up with output? Or how much can we push energy density in these mixes?
Has it kept up with output? I think I've seen a problem in an autumn calving herd recently where they were doing a feed to yield. A very successful, well-run herd, but they were running into fertility and body condition problems. And you could see what had happened is they're on a component, they're on an Arla contract, fed, rewarded well for the components. They kept this feed to yield that worked well 10 years ago, and we've seen what happened, fat and protein. But, suddenly the energy expenditure is way higher. So I think we have to be careful with, we almost have to, the nutrition has to keep up definitely with the component output, because he has changed, going forward, he's going to change his nutrition to keep up with that. Because that feed to yield isn't what it used to be for him, basically.
You had a fascinating insight on ways and artificial intelligence and machine learning. Where do you think is going to be the most impactful innovation in dairy technology over the next, short term, medium term, 5-10 years?
I think the predictive, just the way Waze works, predictive analytics on helping you dial in feed costs and management. It'll be able to, if beef price, it looks like it's not going to go away, high beef prices anytime soon. So, are we going to get in a phase where, if beef price is high, you're making those management decisions on whether to cull and how many to milk. So AI kind of helps with all those things as well. But yeah, just to think that individual and group management, AI is really going to help with, and nutrition.
It is that balance that's quite interesting, because so we're involved with a couple of AI projects at home at the minute. One on health traits, and so a QMS project on Yonis, which is amazing, on an individual cow-by-cow basis, looking at predictive analytics to work out which cows are going to fail the Yonis test, like 12, 18, 24 months before they actually do. And that, on an individual cow basis, that's great. But actually, probably there's as much scope, maybe even more scope, for whole herd management and how we manage cows on a daily basis. We did it. We're part of a project looking at just stupid stuff, and it told me that one person always fed 40 minutes later than the other person, and it's something I never noticed as we were going around. But actually, it made a massive difference because we just started them earlier. Yeah, and it's just stupid stuff like that does make a big difference, and stuff that you just won't see with your own eyes.
In terms of the gains to be made, again, looking at this medium to short-term future, we've talked a lot about genetics and nutrition and talked about management. Where do you think the biggest gains are to be made? Genetics, nutrition, or management?
Probably a combination. As probably the genetics are moving faster than our ability to look after cows, I would say. Probably most farms, the problems have a first name, last name, So I would say it's down to us on the ground to try and help them express their genetics better.
Keep up with the genetic advancements.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Genetics is definitely moving faster than anything else. If you take outside of transition diets, milking diets aren't that significantly different than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. There is room, but realistically, we're fiddling around the edges of milking diets. Management will always continuously improve, but it feels like where the big wins are for us, there's still a lot of genetic stuff, but actually the forage quality and how we manage forages is going to be a big thing as well.
Niall, how are you?
Yeah, I agree. Just the nutrition management, and it's just interesting, when you benchmark what you call Roger Bannister when he broke the 4-minute mile. Nobody thought it was humanly possible, and then a few months later, there were several more, and now there's like a 17-year-old in New Zealand broke it last week. So it's just, it's keeping up with those, not to get back to have another dig at Man United, but Ineos, when they were successful with a cycling team, it's all those little areas of improvement, like small gains, just adding them all together. So I think management nutrition can still unlock a lot of the genetics.
Again, I'll look around the floor to see, is there any questions? Question here. Could we get a mic, please? Do you mind just introducing yourself and before you ask the question, please?
Sean Dooley is my name. The two herd owners today are pedigree breeders, and I'm wondering what advantage does pedigree breeding add to production and profit?
Okay.
You go first.
Absolutely bugger all. Right, so whether you're pedigree or not, right, no difference in profit. We only classify probably because I've got it written into my bull semen contract. I've got to classify, otherwise I'm not sure I'd bother. Between that and we're good at it. We actually did try some crossbreeding I've only got one left. One left, so I guess about 7 or 8 years ago. So we did we took the idea that effectively trying to make a flying herd within our own herd. So we take the bottom end of those Holstein pregnancies, make them crossbred, and then terminal serve them to beef to try and get the heterosis benefit, because it would likely be, we were hoping it would be higher than the genetic gain benefit. So we used Norwegian Reds, and I think it's fair to say they were absolutely dire. They all went lame. Their components were the same as the Holsteins. The milks were about 2,000 litres less. It was awful. So I think the Holstein cow has changed unbelievably in the last 15, 20 years. To the extent that if you want to, she can be a black and white Jersey. And that gain has massively outstripped the benefit that you get from crossbreeding. Being pedigree doesn't really change that. A black and white cow is still a black and white cow, regardless of whether she's got a fancy name or not. I think that's probably where I go.
The way I would look on the pedigree thing, it's more a central point to record who the dam is, who the sire is, keeps the yields all together. It's not that a pedigree cow is worth more than a non-commercial cow, something like that. It's just a central recording point that you have a website, you can go and research stuff pretty easy. That's what I use it for. There could be higher genomic non-commercial or commercial cattle through the country. You just don't know.
Again, I look to the floor for excellent questions. Keith, is your breeding policy different between the two different herds and the two different contracts?
That is a good question. So we're a manufacturing base at home, and we're a liquid base on the secondary. So we effectively try and breed the same cow because we're looking for a cow that, if the market changes, we want something that's still adaptable to your different contracts, right? So we only moved onto that manufacturing base in 2022. And we were on a liquid base before that. But we managed to adapt into that manufacturing base because we hadn't narrowed ourselves down. But what we do is when we choose which animals go to which site, the higher yielding, higher production, higher litres cows that aren't going to be as big on components definitely go one way, and the high component cows go the other way. So yes and no probably is the answer.
And Connor, you have a good calving interval, but it is a block calving. Does this result in cows lost out of the system and cows you don't want to lose?
I don't know if I would call August to April a block. It's a very big block. So it is, but there's cow luck. If they don't fit the system, they go. There's no point keeping passengers. And probably something I've been guilty of over the years, but with beef prices is what they are at the minute, it's probably the greatest opportunity we've ever had at keeping the herds young and keeping the herds fresh. So if they fall out of the system, they fall out of the system. Like as I say, we start bulling at 40 days, 50 days is our voluntary waiting period, but if they're getting beef, they've gone at 40, and we aim to have all the semen in the cows by 80 days, as in once they're hit 65 days and they're not served, they go onto a programme, and if they're not in calf at 200 days, we stop serving them.
Would you say you got your heifers are doing better on robots than they were in a parlour?
Well, we manage the heifers. They've actually got a robot to themselves. So yeah, they've a really good chance now expressing, and fertility is very good in heifers. So like our shades weren't purpose built for a new unit. So we've 2 robots servicing one group. We've 1 robot servicing the heifers, and the other robot, that's what we call our fastest milk, and it's just the way we batch them and the way it has to work for us. But having their own robots a big advantage. You know, they're not actually meeting the rest of the herd to their second calvers.
I think it's one of the things we notice is that the gap between your heifers and your older cows is definitely getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I don't know whether that's because of when we changed to robots, or because of how we changed our management, or genetics, or whatever it is. But that gap is getting smaller, and so actually losing another third calf and replacing with a heifer is not a big loss.
Niall, do you see the same in terms of the gap between heifers and cows, or heifers is equally challenging to manage in terms of metabolic athletes, or are they naturally fitter?
I was interested because there's all this, your heifers should peak at, there's this target rate, 85% of your third lactation. And I was asking a couple of people recently, do you actually ever see that? But there's some people, but I was talking to a dairy in the US, and they were getting 82%, which is probably as high as I've ever seen. But I was looking at just their milk and their body condition curve, and they're peaking really late. They were like 150 days in milk.
Heifers,
so I'd be interested in what you guys do. And when you went robotic, did the heifers peak later?
They would have peaked later because, well, we were in 3 times a day. So the day the heifer calved, she was in 3 times a day milking.
Yeah.
But in a robotic system, she's not in 3 times a day. She's in and settled, and it takes her longer.
Yeah.
So I would find my peak is later, but they do stay
Yeah.
very level, like very, very level. Yeah. What would you think, Keith?
It's interesting because actually I think cows peak earlier and heifers peak later.
Right.
Cows like really go at it.
Yeah, they really do. And so that's sort of interesting. And yeah, so we're set at 82% today.
Right.
But that's the highest we've ever been.
Yeah.
And I don't know what we'd do to get higher because it's bloody hard work getting up there. The other really weird thing that has made a big difference to us, actually going on to robots, is that DMB cows last forever. They just keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going. And so you're less worried about putting cows onto a colt list because they'll probably still be there in 18 months, 2 years' time. So that does make quite a big difference, and that's a big change since we went on to robots.
I have one final question, but I'll do another sweep around the hall for hands up. Any questions from the floor? And one final wrap-up question to all 3. We'll start with Keith. What advice, and I see a lot of young farmers in the room, what advice would you give a young farmer when deciding between investing in genetics or automation?
I mean, if you can cash flow it, do it. I think that's, if you're going to look at automation, like if you can make it pencil, just do it because it will pay back every time. Labour's getting more expensive. I mean, and this feels like a really exciting time to be a dairy farmer, right? This is probably the best year we're ever going to have. Or touch wood, next year's better, but this is a phenomenal year for feed price and milk price ratios, and everything we can do to make that system more efficient, more sustainable, more long-term, feels like a sensible thing to do. But, in the grand scheme of things, your genetic investments don't have to be big. You can make huge gains by spending an extra £1 on semen, or just even keeping your prices the same but making better choices. Genomic testing is not a big cost in the grand scheme of things, but the biggest thing about whatever investments you choose, whether they be small genetic investments or massive investments in robots, you've got to change your management to utilize that information or that technology. If you just keep doing the same thing, then it'll be pointless.
Connor.
Why does it have to be a choice between
Why
one
does
and
it
the
have
other?
to be both? Yes,
Yeah.
that's the...
Well, the first thing I would say, look, we put in our first heat detection system in 08, and you see that technology that does something for you that you don't have to do, it's self-financing. Heat detection, rumination, it doesn't take a lot of improvement gains to pay for that. Do without the flash tractor, go for them type of things that really help you, like rumination collar, robots, decide if you're wanting to go down the robotic route, but all them things, labour's hard to find, and it's like having a herdsman there 24/7, robots or heat detection or rumination, all that type of stuff. So definitely go for it.
Go for it, both if possible. Niall, what do you see out there in your experience?
I think it's very context dependent, really, on your situation. But yeah, they both can be very good investments. One thing the interesting thing about the dairy industry is there's just so many ways to skin a cat and be successful. So I think the main thing is whatever gives you the buzz and gives you the interest in the job is as important as anything. I mean, you can see these two are very successful and good at both. But whatever gives you that buzz really is important.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all our speakers, Connor, Keith, and Niall, for 3 excellent and thought-provoking presentations. Could I ask you to put your hands together for them, please? I think we've seen today that high output systems demand not just more from cows, but also more precision, more adaptability from us as farmers and from vets and from advisors. Thanks to you as well for your attention and engagement this morning. We'll now break for lunch and return for the next session at 1:45. Enjoy the break. Please take the opportunity to catch up with the speakers if you have any more questions. Thank you.